I'm going to describe two hypothetical story antagonists to you, and I want you to think about which one you hate more from these descriptions, which one gives you a stronger emotional reaction. Character A is a supervillain who accidentally killed someone during an armed robbery and then was put in prison for it. In prison, he became more and more resentful and eventually broke free, then went on a killing spree in anger. He took the lives of 107 people, then out of even further spite for the world and his life, he went back to armed robbery and stole $200,000 from a charity. Character B is the most popular guy in a group of friends that just recently got a new member in our protagonist, Ashley. Ashley was a very timid person at her prior school, but at this school has decided that she's going to make friends and she's going to overcome her fear of singing in front of other people because she really wants to be a professional singer. After building her confidence through taking singing classes and thinking she's finally found a great group of friends, she builds up the nerve to go and talk to character B, who she's never had a one-on-one conversation with and has always been kind of intimidated by, and asks him if he'd be willing to encourage the rest of their group to come to the school's talent show, where she's going to sing in front of a large group for the very first time. In a cool and charming voice, he says, "Yeah, sure, we'll be there." She's incredibly grateful to him and admits how terrified she is to sing in front of so many other people. And he says that he's actually a bit of a singer himself and is excited to see what she can do. Little did she know that character B actually had those same insecurities about getting in front of other people and singing, but he'd never pushed himself to get over them. And because of that, he felt bitter towards someone who could. So the day of the talent show comes and she is so nervous but feels encouraged seeing her friends in the front row. So she has the nerve to get out on stage despite shaking as she does and starts into her song, and because of her nerves, she actually does mess up a bunch of the notes early in the song. She's rattled to a point of thinking that she should just leave the stage mid-song, but she pushes through it, wanting to impress character B and the rest of her friends and do this for herself, and she knows that there is one big fantastic note coming later in the song that she can nail. So she keeps singing, she gets back on track, her confidence is building, and she's getting to that note. There's a pause just before it to help it hit that much more. And then in that pause, to her horror, character B yells out, "Learn how to sing before you get on stage." That simple phrase shatters her. She misses the big beat of the song as her so-called group of friends start laughing at her and other members of the crowd start laughing too. She can't go on and she just runs off stage with her knees shaking and collapses into a ball and cries. Not only was she embarrassed in front of all of those people in a way worse than she'd ever feared, but she clearly hadn't made the supportive group of friends that she thought she had. Character B knew how scared she was, and he'd embarrassed her like that anyway. And scene. Now, objectively speaking, I'm guessing that most people listening would agree that what character A did is a lot worse than what character B did. Killing 107 people in cold blood and stealing tons of money from a charity is worse than being mean to someone at a talent show. But I'd also guess the majority of people listening also have a stronger hatred for character B. And that leads to my first tip in this episode on how to write great villains. The way to make your audience really love to hate your villain and have a strong emotional reaction to them isn't to just list a bunch of bad things that your villain has done. It's to make your audience feel directly connected to the pain that your villain has caused. The audience was likely feeling excited for Ashley. She was building confidence after having been a very shy person. She was pushing past her own limitations to get on stage and sing in front of other people. Being confident enough to not just get up on stage, but to keep going even when she was messing up. And then our villain tore her down in a peak moment of happiness. Describing it differently, I could have made you feel much more furious at character A. I could have told you a story from the perspective of the child of someone he killed, or the person who runs the charity who was just about to hit their fundraising goals. So when you're writing a villain that you want your audience to really love to hate, think about how you can make them feel the full weight of the bad things this villain has done. Now, in this episode, I'm going to give you all of my favorite advice for writing villains that I try to keep in mind myself when I'm writing villains, but it's not just going to be stuff for how to write a villain that your audience loves to hate. That's going to be, roughly half of this video, and the other half will be how to write an antagonist that your audience actually wants to root for to see redeemed. And, advice for writing a villain that's somewhere in the middle of that spectrum. For people that are new here, usually on this channel I'm releasing 2 fiction stories every week. Nowadays they're usually chapters of ongoing series, but this is my 3rd writing advice episode. I am really enjoying making these. This topic specifically was requested by subscriber Alan Moore 5886, and if anyone else does have a request for a writing advice topic, leave that request in the comments and I will consider it. Now on to more villain advice.
Hit like if you want, subscribe if you feel like, but either way, enjoy the show.
Now the second tip I'm going to give is kind of building off the first one, and I'm going to call it high contrast pain. And what I mean by that is this moment where you want your audience to really start hating your villain or building on that hatred that they might already have from earlier in the story. A really great way to make that hatred build more in them is to have your villain do something really terrible to your main character or one of the good characters in the story when that character is at a really, really happy, positive moment. Kicking someone when they're down can obviously make you dislike a character as well, but if you have a character that's feeling incredible, has just overcome some kind of obstacle in their life, has built confidence for the first time like Ashley had in that example I gave in the beginning, if you take a character from being in a really, really great, happy place, have the villain strike in a way that tears that down completely, that will make your audience feel that pain so much more and make them so much more eager for your hero to get one up on the villain. One of the best examples of this, in my opinion, that comes to mind is from the 1976 film Carrie, based on the Stephen King novel. And if you haven't seen it or don't know the story of Carrie, Carrie is very shy, has been bullied at school. She's got a mother who's not doing her any favors in terms of helping her be more popular or being emotionally well-adjusted for life, but is asked to prom by one of the best looking guys at school. She gets to prom and she's actually having a really great time. Her mom told her before going that everyone was going to laugh at her, but Carrie didn't believe it. She feels like things are really turning around for her. And she's even made the prom queen and goes up on stage with the guy she's gone with, and she's feeling so incredible, but then her school bullies pull a string and dump a bucket of pig blood on her in front of everyone, and everyone starts laughing. Or at least she thinks everyone starts laughing. I think if you read into it, it's left up to interpretation if that's what she thinks is happening versus what's actually happening. But the point is, she was feeling incredible, and then the villain struck. And that makes you hate them just so much more. In general, I'd actually say that a lot of my best advice for writing or any kind of art is actually to have some really great high contrast moments. I mean, if you think about in a dance song, one of the biggest moments in that is just before the beat drops, and usually that builds up to a point of silence or very, very quiet music, and then boom, it hits and everyone goes wild. Or even in art, the point that your eye is drawn to most is the highest point of contrast in an image. So regardless of what kind of art you're making, always try to think about high contrast. Where can you add it in to really get people's attention or really make some emotions hit? Now the next piece of advice for making a hateable villain is to work in some traits that you really dislike in people in real life. Making the villain hateable isn't just about the big things, it's about the subtle little things in the way they talk, in their passive aggressiveness or lack of self-awareness, or just general rudeness. And as a little way to introduce this, let's do a little experiment here where we pretend that this video is a fiction video that you're watching, and I want to make myself come across as the villain and get you to start really disliking me. Here's something that I would probably write for this villain being me. Look, I know what I'm talking about. If you don't work this advice into your stories, I'm sorry, but they're not gonna be any good. And the second a publisher reads your manuscript, they're just gonna throw it out if they see that you're making these dumb mistakes. Now let's break down why that would make you start subtly hating, or maybe even more overtly hating, this character version of me that I invented. For one, I'm asserting that I know better than you, even though I have no idea who you are. Maybe someone listening is an incredibly successful writer. I wouldn't know, I'm putting this out into the void of the internet. And the thing that I think makes it that much more frustrating is it's only a subtle distinction from what I'm actually doing in this video. Like, hopefully this video is coming across as me saying, here's writing advice that works for me, and hopefully it could work for you as well. Whereas this villain version of me that I wrote feels like they're coming at it more from a place of trying to make themselves seem superior to those listening. Like they're subconsciously trying to inflate their own ego with the way they're presenting the information, saying, I'm better than you, so you need to listen to me. 2, anyone that knows my career or heard the intro in this video probably has a good understanding that I don't work with publishers, so me saying that a publisher is going to throw out your manuscript if you don't do the things that I'm saying you have to do is nonsense. I wouldn't know what a publisher wants. I mean, I have a general idea, but I haven't gone through the process myself. And then also, I just referred to you as making dumb mistakes, when again, I haven't read your writing. And a genuinely positive or inspiring character wouldn't say that you're making dumb mistakes, they would say that any mistakes you're making are a part of the process, and that every book in history you could look at and has some kind of mistakes in it. Giving your villains relatably irritating traits, especially worked into their dialogue in subtle ways, or maybe even overt ways, is a great way to help your audience hate them that much more and be that much more frustrated by them. Seeing reflections of people your audience dislikes in real life in these villains, and you can work this into stories that aren't set in reality that's similar to ours. You can put it into elaborate sci-fi or high fantasy. Regardless of the setting, people are still people, and they can have relatably frustrating traits. Something that I've tried to work into one of my stories recently called the Trismegistus Academy, a series that's only 2 episodes in now, and is a good introduction to my work. If you want to start watching it, I'll link the playlist in the description. But one of my more irredeemable villains is the villain in this story, Eloise Ludum. For simplicity's sake, we'll say she's essentially running a superhero school that's more likely to pump out supervillains. If her students don't live up to her very high expectations, she'll force them into situations where they have to fight monsters and are likely to not survive it, and she does so under the guise of saying she's doing this for their own good, and that facing these very difficult situations is a great way to build strength and resilience and confidence. Now, the subtle trait that I'm working in there that really frustrates me personally is when someone takes a really good moral and just kind of twists it into a negative and acts as though they're doing something good for you. Facing really difficult situations is a great way to build confidence and resilience, but forcing kids into a situation where they literally might die and claiming you're doing it for their own good is one of those more subtle ways to help make you really dislike this character. And then I contrast that with the headmistress of another school, the Trismegistus Academy, where she allows students to put themselves into difficult and frustrating situations, but never forces them into it and lets them tap out when they need to. Another trait I worked into a villain of mine that I admit from my series Mytholethal, Tarsa, for most of it, felt a little bit too mustache-twirling kind of villain. You know, someone who just wants to rule the world for ruling the world's sake. And I kind of noticed that I hadn't given her enough depth yet, so in the last few chapters I started working in some of these subtle traits to really hate. One of the main ones being that I had her acting like she was the victim in a situation where clearly she was doing so many more things bad. In the final chapter, she's in a fight with one of her descendants, one of the main characters, Mythal, and when she sees that she's losing this fight, she starts talking as though Mythal is being incredibly disrespectful to her elder, and that it's cruel for Mythal to not be respecting her because Tarsa is essentially the reason Mythal was born. Well, yes, technically true, Mythal wouldn't have been born if it wasn't for Tarsa, but that's another great way to just make a character that much more frustrating when they work in a little bit of truth into a lie or into a situation like this, where she's trying to make it seem like she's the victim of this situation, where she's acting very entitled, as though Mythal should follow her orders just because of their familial bond. So it's a good idea to think of some traits that you really dislike, that frustrate you the most in people that you know in real life, and put those things right in your villain, to give your audience a little bit of extra when they're coming across your villain's dialogue or actions. And on the topic of Tarsa, this is actually a little bit of a tangent, but one thing that is writing advice that I want to give to people in general is that your story, for your story to be really good, it doesn't have to have everything. Like I said, Tarsa felt a little bit like wants to rule the world for ruling the world's sake, didn't have a really great reason for it, but I still really like how Mytholethal turned out because that story wasn't about making the villain have a lot of depth. Obviously, it's good to work in depth in lots of different areas of your story, but if you're writing a story right now and the villain isn't super deep, if that's not something that's the point of your story, you probably don't have to worry about it that much. Like, I would recommend working in little things like what I'm suggesting here just to give the villain a little bit more of a well-rounded feel. But if you've got a really great character dynamic set for your main characters, or a really cool plot, or really good lore in your story, people aren't gonna think your story's garbage just because one area of it isn't super fleshed out. Focus on the thing that you want to focus on, and then just consider working in some little extra tips to flesh out other things a little bit more. Now I'm going to move into more relatable villains. Villains that your audience either looks at and goes, oh wow, they've got a pretty good point or a good reason for what they're doing, or even looks at and goes, wow, I like them enough that I want them to be redeemed and end up working with the hero of the story. And I'm going to generally refer to these kinds of villains as just antagonists. This is kind of my personal definition, but I look at the spectrum of villainy as having overt villains on one side, the kind of villain that is just obviously explicitly doing terrible things without a good reason. Some iterations of the Joker might fall into there. And then on the other side, there's the antagonists, who aren't necessarily doing anything wrong, they're just working in direct opposition of the goals of the main character. So an example of this would be in a sports movie. If we're following the green team as our heroes or the protagonists, and the antagonists are the red team, the people trying to beat them in the sports competition, the red team isn't necessarily doing anything wrong at all. They're just competing in a sport and trying to win like everyone else is. They'd only start shifting down the spectrum into villainy a bit more if they do something like burn down the green team's gym or something like that so they can't practice as well. The end of overt villainy, the main clip that I think of when I think of it is,
well, you know what they say. Can't bake a pie without losing a dozen men.
Oh, that was horrible. Your wish is horrible. You're horrible. You're an irredeemable monster.
What took you so long, idiot?
man, Puss in Boots: The Last Wish is such a good movie, and actually thinking about it, it's got the three different types of villains that I think of when I think of villains. It's got one who is just an irredeemable monster. It's got one who is sort of a bad guy, but you can understand why he's doing what he's doing. He's kind of just doing his job. And then you've got the antagonists who end up working with the heroes by the end of the story. Wow, that movie is kind of like a masterclass in writing different types of villains. If you haven't watched it, highly recommend. I'm probably going to watch it again tonight, to be honest. But anyway, now with our spectrum defined and antagonist being the term I'll go with, let's move into the first piece of advice for relatable villains. The first piece of advice I'll give is nice and simple, but also very effective. And that is to just think about what is the goal of my main character or my protagonists, and how can I make the antagonist's goal in direct contradiction to that without just making them do overtly horrible things. The sports example is a nice easy one. We cheer for the green team, the antagonists are the red team. The red team doesn't actually have to be bad guys, and you could write some really good relatable characters onto that team that we like, but we're just not rooting for them because we're cheering for the green team. But one of my favorite examples of an incredible antagonist is from the movie Princess Mononoke. It was made by Hayao Miyazaki, and tons of his movies have really great antagonists in them. Very rarely does he just write characters that are overt villains, except maybe in Castle in the Sky, where that one was inspired by old pulp serial kinds of stories, and he wanted to go for a more overt villain. But anyway, to give a brief summary of the character dynamics in Princess Mononoke, and again, I highly recommend you watch it if you haven't seen it. I'm pretty sure Netflix has a deal with Studio Ghibli, so all the movies are on there, depending on what country you live in. But our main character is Ashitaka, who has been cursed by a demon that came from a land that's in conflict. He goes to visit these lands to see with eyes unclouded by hate, and try to figure out how to end the conflict that's happening here. He finds himself in Irontown, a thriving village surrounded by forests that are being destroyed by the town. The woman running this town is Lady Eboshi, our main antagonist. She has seen lots of people suffering in her life, and when she took command of Irontown, she wanted to make it a thriving place for all, and more specifically to help the women of her village not be subjugated in the same way she's seen of women in other regions, and give them more agency and authority here. She has built Irontown up to a place that is really thriving and people are happy and successful, but the way she's doing that is by destroying and mining the forests around her, not caring about the animals she's killing in the process. This puts her in direct conflict with the titular character of the movie, Princess Mononoke, who was raised by wolves and cares more about the animals and the forest than about Irontown. So Ashitaka comes in trying to bring peace to these two groups. trying to show them that they can live in harmony. Lady Eboshi just doesn't see that as a possibility and doesn't want to come to any kind of compromise, so she just keeps destroying the forest and trying to kill the forest spirit to weaken the forest further so that her town can continue to thrive and mine more of the area around them. Obviously, it's easy to look at what she's doing and say that's not a good thing to do, but it's not as objectively horrible as if she was just destroying the forests for fun. You can understand why she's doing what she's doing, and you may even be rooting for her to succeed. You don't necessarily want her to get major comeuppance, you just want her to achieve her goal in a different way than she's going about achieving it. And that, to me, is the makings of a fantastic villain. Again, a villain that is just horrible can be really good too. But they can end up feeling that much more engaging to your audience if your audience can look at them and go, yeah, I get why they're doing this, and I kinda still want them to succeed. Another tip that you can use to give your antagonist a more redeemable feel, or at least make them more understandable to your audience and feeling more like a real character, is give them a strict life philosophy that they follow. For instance, you could give an antagonist the philosophy of only the strong can survive. Now, that one might push them a little bit more towards the villain end of the spectrum, but the idea is that making them follow this can make them a more engaging character. So you can force them to go through a difficult circumstance where they have to make a difficult decision. Like, let's say our antagonist has the philosophy of only the strong can survive, and they're the leader of a team of supervillains. And they have a right-hand man that is their closest friend, their closest confidant, and the person that they turn to when they're unsure of what decision to make, or something like that. And then this right-hand man starts slipping down in terms of this moral, like he starts getting weaker and isn't valuing strength in some way. The rest of the group starts to see that this is the case, and our lead antagonist starts to see this as well, and he's forced to make a difficult decision. Then he decides he has to stick to this philosophy and executes his right-hand man, even though it's not something he wants to do. Having your antagonist make a difficult decision that is in line with the moral they claim to have is a good way to help make them feel like a more engaging character. And even if your audience doesn't agree with their moral, they at least respect them on the level of they have this moral and they're following through with it. Then you could take this in two different possible directions depending on what you want your villain to be by the end of the story. You can have them keep getting into situations where they have to make more and more difficult decisions like that, and they can either keep going along with this life philosophy and going, yes, this is what I believe, I am sticking to it no matter what I have to do, and that itself is respectable despite the fact that we disagree with this villain, and is likely keeping them in direct conflict with our protagonist. Or down the line of these decisions, they can see that this isn't the right thing for them. They can start to see the cracks in their philosophy and maybe eventually admit that they were wrong. And this pushes them into a redemption arc where they end up working with the hero, or at least against their own team of villains, or whatever it may be. Really, as just a little side note, a way to make any story more interesting and make any character feel a little bit more fleshed out and have your audience understand them more is to force them to make some really difficult decisions, and then make it clear to the audience why that character ended up going with the decision they made. One of my longer-running villains, Fear herself, or Arava, is someone who has had the life philosophy that if you can't overcome your fears, your life isn't worth living. So essentially, she creates demons that seek out really fearful people and torment them and then eventually kill them if they don't overcome their fears. If they overcome their fear and start living a better life, then the demons will generally just leave them alone. But if they don't overcome their fears and they just succumb to this demon, they'll end up dying, and she thinks, morally speaking, she's done the right thing because they were living a life of fear anyway, and that's not a good life to live. She's one of those sorts of characters that kind of follows a philosophy that I believe in, but just takes it way too far. Encouraging people to face and overcome their fears can help them live a better life, but, forcing them into a situation where they either overcome their fears or die in the process is, not something I encourage. And I actually started pushing her towards a redemption arc this year when I made an episode called Fear Isn't Enough. And I had a lot of fun giving my audience a bit of emotional whiplash because I had a bunch of episodes where I build her up to be really horrible, give her a lot of really terrible traits. She grants physical form to these 7 demons called the Archon demons, thinking that they will enact the same philosophy she believes in to the entire multiverse that my stories take place in, instead of her just doing her thing in her world. But then after the Archon demons have been awakened for a while, she starts seeing that they're just kind of killing lots of people without giving them a chance to overcome their fears. So then she goes to face off against one of them and confront him, and then because of his psychological manipulation abilities, he's able to take us back into this character's backstory. We finally learn about how she got where she is, and we go from having her be a character that lots of people in my audience really hated, to a point where a bunch of people in my audience are like, oh, I get why she's like this, and I kinda want her to redeem herself now. And that's another tip that's kind of a bit of a cliche at this point, but it works. Giving your villain a tragic backstory is a good way to make him feel a little bit more relatable and understandable to your audience. Another thing you can do to help your audience like a villain more, or make them feel like they might be redeemable or redeemed at some point in the story, is to do something with your villain that is often recommended to do with your hero. Give them a save the cat moment. If you're not familiar with the term save the cat, there's a book by that name that I don't actually know if I've read it. I think maybe I read it in university, but either way, it's supposed to be a very great book for helping writers, and the term save the cat was coined by Blake Snyder about a particular plot point in a story, where early on in a story you have your protagonist do something heroic that helps establish them as a good person and helps the audience want to root for them. You know, you could literally have them saving a cat. But you could also give something like this to your antagonist, even mixing it in to a scene where they're doing a bunch of bad things to help show that they're not a total monster. A simple example would be if you've got an antagonist that's a bank robber and they're in a high-speed chase trying to get away from the police after they've stolen a bunch of money, and then they swerve their car to avoid hitting a cat. They're risking that they might not get away from the police and maybe even crash their car, but it shows that while they are a bank robber and they are an antagonist, they're not a total monster and they're not willing to kill an adorable animal to get away. One of my personal favorite examples of this, which isn't actually a great example, but I just think it's a really good goofy one, is from a Marvel and DC comic book crossover, where I haven't read the full comic, but I think the Joker and Red Skull were working together to this point in the story, where Joker then realizes that Red Skull is a Nazi, and he goes like, wait a minute, you're actually a Nazi? And Red Skull's like, well yeah, I'm a Nazi, and you know, I think you'd make a great Nazi, Joker, what's the problem? And then the Joker goes, I may be a criminal lunatic, but I'm an American criminal lunatic. And then he attacks Red Skull. And that's obviously kind of a corny example, and I don't know, I mean, depending on the version of the Joker, I don't know if it's really in character, but I mean, there's been so many different eras and iterations of the Joker that, you know, I trust that the writer probably knew the version they were working with at the time. But the point is, it shows that even the Joker had a line that he wasn't willing to cross. But I'm sure that you, with your writing, could come up with a better save the cat kind of moment for your villain that doesn't take them all the way out of being an antagonist, but helps your audience see that there is good in them. I guess that's all the advice that I have for today, but on the closing note with a sort of last piece of advice is just to remember that your villain doesn't have to be strictly one thing or the other. They don't have to be an explicitly bad, villainous villain, and they don't have to be just a character that clearly could be the hero of their own story. They can fall somewhere in the middle, and it can be good to experiment in different stories with different types of villains, or even within the same story. Like I mentioned, Puss in Boots is a great example of a movie that has a bunch of different types of antagonists in it. If you got something out of this, first of all, you might want to subscribe, and, you know, hitting the like button's always helpful. Leave a comment if there's another topic you'd want me to talk about, or if you haven't seen my previous writing advice episodes, I have one on writing great character dynamics, and I have one on how to not get stuck in the planning process and actually enjoy the process of writing your stories. Or if you want to hear how I apply this stuff in my stories, you can check out the fiction stuff that makes up most of this channel. I've got a bunch of long-running series that are basically like audiobooks, where I'm releasing different chapters of different stories twice a week. My personal favorite right now is probably Starseed Psyche, which is 4 episodes in. It's very anime, manga, and personal development inspired. That's meant to inspire people to live a better life in their real lives while also being entertained by the story. Then the Trismegistus Academy is only 2 episodes in, but I think it's really shaping up to be a good, fun, young adult novel type story about kids at competing superhero schools. But the best place to start would probably just be my playlist at the top of my homepage. That's the, like, if you're new to PopCross stories, start here, and it's got a bunch of the best first episodes to jump in on, or at least episodes you can watch without any prior knowledge of my previous series. And my book Vigilance will be releasing very soon. By the time you're watching this, my proofreader has finished it, and I'm just doing one little pass through before I finally get it up for release. But anyway, besides that, that's all for today, except of course for ending this video on some kind of positive or inspiring note. And the inspiring note, I think might have even been the one that I put in the Stop Planning, Start Writing episode, or Start Planning, Writing episode. But it's basically that if you're looking to be a professional writer or artist or anything like that, don't make it so big in your head. There are tons of people in the world that are making a living at the thing that you want to make a living at, and if they can do it, that means you can too. There's nothing that they've achieved that you don't have the capability of achieving. I've been making a full-time living, self-employed as a writer and illustrator, making my YouTube videos on here for over 5 years now, and I'm just some guy. I'm not saying that in a self-deprecating way. I love my career, I love myself, I'm happy with what I'm doing, but if I can do it, it means that you can too. I hope that's inspiring. I love you all, and I'll see you all in the next episode on Friday. Fear of the Demon Hunters, Episode 2. See you there. Goodbye.